I'm Carl Niehaus, and this is In My Crosshairs, Conversations with Carl Niehaus. Here I will talk about my own views and also interview thought leaders and political players throughout our country and internationally. You as viewers are invited to participate, to share with each other, to invite other viewers, to register, and of course, all important, hit that notification bell so that you're always part of this important conversation and engagement on our revolutionary journey for a more just and radically transformed South Africa.
Isibongo zika Carl Niehaus. Mpangazitha omhlophe qondaba ezitha. Inyoni emhlophe kwajengelanda ephula amaphiwa zamazama umhlaba. Inkanyamba endizele phezulu nyakazi bhakabhaka. Mpangazitha omhlophe qondaba ezitha. Umshawa wa monopoly capital elanga lishisa. Babaleka ongqoka kunezise inkulu bacasha patriot babazonina. Imthandela bethu mahashula kanacala. Mpangazitha imthandela bethu FIFA nqamalala. Mpangazitha imthandela bethu umnotho nomhlaba ufinyelele ezandleni zabantu abamnyama. Omhlophe qondaba ezitha imthande ngokuhlusa nokukhuthaza i-radical economic transformation wangadibala. Carl Niehaus umafele empini njengesotsha uma kade bona eHollywood lesihonga amazigahla amabhunu bandlulula abaleka mayimbona umbulali wabulala apartheid ngamazwi umthakatho indaba walo mbuso bandlululo qede South Africa yaba kwi-democracy isibhamu esikhumela thule house bathukizana uSirili onondaba abahleka abafayitsini kwemagwalandini la kuyofika khona umkhonto esizwe kuyoqhumisa.
Welcome to Mpangazitha in Conversation. This is a new series of conversations as part of my YouTube channel, In My Crosshairs. Today is the inaugural conversation. I'm talking to Professor Chris Malikane, Associate Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of the Witwatersrand. Professor Malikane has written extensively about the South African economy and specifically also about the importance of the implementation of radical economic transformation in terms of the resolutions of the 54th National Conference of the African National Congress from 2017. He also addressed the issue of white monopoly capitalism and whether this concept is something new which was just developed recently, or whether it finds itself within the writings and the expressions of economic inequality within the African National Congress and its documents. Chris, welcome to Mpangazitha in Conversation.
Thank you, Carl.
Do you also want to greet the viewers?
Thank you, Carl, and thank you to the viewers for having me. And I think that this platform is a unique platform where we can freely conversate and talk about issues without being constrained in an environment where we feel that certain political issues cannot be raised. So this platform is very, very important for the viewers and for South Africans at large.
Yes, and as I've said earlier, in conversations also with fellow friends and comrades when we decided to have these discussions, it must be a no-holds-barred conversation. It must be one where we talk our minds, where I personally have my own views and opinions. I'm not planning to be an objective journalist. I'm here to be in conversation with you, and I think the viewers know both my views and your views. Let's kick off, Chris. Can you give us an indication of how you see the current South African economic situation, where you think we find ourselves, and then we talk about what the future is holding, and in fact also what the future should hold?
Thank you. And I think that the main thing that we should look at is to first and foremost understand the social forces that are currently dominant in South Africa, and then from there we can draw conclusions about their interests vis-a-vis the interests of the population, particularly the working class. As matters stand, the dominant social force, as I've always argued, is white monopoly capital. And this social force has got very powerful international backing, but also it has very powerful backing from within the African National Congress.
So you say that white monopoly capitalism, or the concept of white monopoly capitalism, is not some brainchild of a British PR company, Bell Pottinger?
Not at all, not at all. I think that during the debate in 2017, those who wanted to ridicule the concept of radical economic transformation went too far to distort history by denying the fact that there is a force, a social, socio-economic and political force, which we characterized in the National Liberation Movement as white monopoly capital. So in that process, many people unfortunately got misled to think that putting racial labels to class concepts is so-called unscientific, when in fact it is reflecting the concrete realities that we face in the country. I mean, even Joe Slovo in 1988 did say that putting racial descriptors to class forces in South Africa is not of our making, but it's a reflection of the concrete situation. The ANC in 1969 also said the same thing, that the struggle in South Africa will take a dominantly racial form until the historical inequalities, the historical injustices have been resolved. Then the struggle can then move away from those forms to take other forms.
Can you then explain to me how it happened that Joel Nichethenze went to the policy conference of the ANC in 2017 and said there's no such thing as white monopoly capitalism? And I remember he was even supported by Paul Mashatile.
Well, like I said before, I think we need to think of white monopoly capital having allies. Mm-hmm. So in having allies, that position that was adopted by Joel was clearly a means of making this social force. So
are you saying that Joel is an ally of white monopoly capitalism?
Ideologically, yes. If you deny that historical fact and you try to hide the racial character of the class that dominates, then basically you are giving cover, to the social force. You are duping, you are trying to obfuscate the concrete reality as it presents itself in South Africa today, which is still racial in form dominantly, even if fundamentally it's class. But it takes the form of race. Yeah.
And the historical documents of the African National Congress that refer to white monopoly capitalism, you wrote a paper, if I remember correctly, it was about 4 or 5 pages, number of points over years, yes, indicating how the concept of white monopoly capitalism were actually developed in those documents of the African National Congress and of the South African Communist Party.
Yes, and yes, I showed that actually the people who crafted the concept was the South African Communist Party in its document in 1959, The Road to South African Freedom. Yeah. For the first time in the history of the literature of the National Liberation Movement, the concept finds expression. And then in various ways, leaders of the ANC also used the concept, white monopolization, of the economy, white dominance, white domination, white this, white that. So the issue, as it turned out in the debate, it was not necessarily the fact that there is white monopoly capital, but white, you can't mention white. Because once you mention that thing, that concept of white domination, white supremacy, white capital, white monopoly capital, it exposes the handlers, the true handlers of the people who are trying to hide the continued racial character. Because it's an embarrassment to these people, because remember, the ANC had international support. we had a very strong anti-apartheid movement that was supporting the ANC. So for us to continue almost 30 years after the ANC took over, to talk about continued white domination, white supremacy, white capital, white this, white that, then the social forces, the progressive forces internationally, begin to ask questions, but what is the ANC doing, failing to dismantle this phenomenon?
But what do you think went wrong? Because you say, yes, we had all the support. We were part of the liberation struggle.
Yeah.
In that liberation struggle, over years, we developed policy documents which made it very clear that we must fight white monopoly capitalism, which also stated that it was necessary for us to go through a program of nationalization of some of the heights of our economy, some of the major sectors of our economy. And then suddenly, somewhere along the line, in between returning from exile, before even we having our first national democratic elections on the 27th of April, whoop, nationalization gets dropped. And suddenly there's a new economic policy program. What went wrong? How did we end up here? And how did those early developments and those changes in policy, shifts in policy, implicate on us 30 years down the line, still being in this grip of white monopoly capitalism?
I think what happened from the mid-80s to the early 90s, there were efforts by white monopoly capital to get inroads, to capture certain leaders of the National Liberation Movement. And those that could be captured were captured. And as the literature is emerging, the ANC was infiltrated. I mean, if you read Chris Haney's memorandum towards Morogoro, that memorandum is scary because he reveals that in the top echelons of the ANC, there were leaders who had links with organizations that were in opposition to the National Liberation Movement. So the ANC was heavily infiltrated, and the leadership of the ANC was, in that sense, already ideologically conflicted. And by the time we reached 1990, white monopoly capital was confident that there is a significant cadre within the ANC leadership that it had captured that will negotiate in a particular path. That is why I think some of the leading radical forces or cadres in the leadership of the ANC passed away. They died mysteriously in the late 80s, early 90s, you know, because you needed to eliminate these voices, the Chris Haneys, you know, you needed to silence these voices, the Tony Yengenis, you know, the Winnie Madikizela Mandelas, the Mzala Nxumalos, you know, all these forces that were genuinely committed to national liberation, had committed class suicide, as Amilcar Cabral said, firm on the path of national liberation, had to be eliminated, silenced, marginalized, and these forces, this cadre that has been captured by white monopoly capital had to be elevated. You know, there are some leaders, for example, that are claiming to be heroes, you know, emerging all of a sudden. And when you ask experienced cadres of the movement who are in the margins, where is this comrade from? The way this comrade speaks ideologically, it's not in line with the historical documents of the ANC. Then you hear that, no, this comrade disappeared from 1970 and emerged as a hero in the early 90s. So many things happened that still need to be unpacked by comrades to tell us exactly what happened to the ANC in exile.
Are you talking about the Mavusu Msemangs of this world?
Exactly.
Who apparently was part of Umkhonto weSizwe, but the comrades don't remember Mavusu Msemang in the camps in exile.
Yes.
While the people in London, especially middle class and urbane London, remember Mavusu Msemang very well.
Yes, and you know, when you talk about London, we know that the London office was a hotbed of spies. It's written, it's already there in the literature, that the London office of the African National Congress was heavily infiltrated. And that London office was responsible for issuing out some of the theoretical writings of the African National Congress, of the South African Communist Party, of Umkhonto weSizwe and so forth. Yet, the very same office turned out to be infested with spies.
So what you're actually saying is that monopoly capital, and specifically white monopoly capital, worked with a very long-term plan. And they were already putting into place their plans for the transition that had to take place, and eventually the negotiations. And by the time that the negotiations started, they were confident that they had people in place that were going to end up negotiating a settlement that will allow their interests and white monopoly capital as such to continue to remain in control.
Exactly. And those people would use their political capital to convince the masses of the people to accept their negotiated settlement as reflecting the views of the masses, because they carried a lot of historical leadership experience. They've been projected as people who sacrificed for our struggle, and all of that. So when they come back and say, okay, we've negotiated that we should hold off on nationalization, we should not expropriate land, no free education, we'll build small RDP houses, we'll do this and that and that. So people would accept because these are their leaders. But by that time, they were gone.
But you're talking also about the strength of the brand of the African National Congress as a liberation movement.
Exactly.
Which is clear to me that there were those within white monopoly capitalism that saw this brand as a very important tool that they could use to manipulate and subjugate the people of South Africa and get them to buy into this very compromised, negotiated settlement that we ended up with in South Africa. So in that context, then emerged people like Tito Mboweni. And also, and forgive me for putting it like this, also Ubani Law. Remember, there was the interesting event in 1991 at the ANC's national conference, the first legal national conference after the African National Congress was unbanned. And there on the stage was President Oliver Tambo. And he said, when one Cyril Ramaphosa entered the hall, he pointed at him and said, Ubani Law.
So was that true?
It's true. You can go and ask comrades who sat there on that table.
Yeah.
They will confirm to you. So for me, it wasn't just perhaps that President Tambo didn't immediately recognize Cyril Ramaphosa. It was President Tambo's question, which becomes, in the historical context, a much bigger question.
Yeah.
And Advocate Ngwaku Ramatlodi, who was there, he was special assistant to President Tambo. Yesterday, on the telephone, one of my comrades phoned him because we were bantering about this Ubani Law thing.
Yeah.
He said, no, but Ngwaku knows about it. Phoned him, put him on speakerphone. Ngwaku said, yes, that's what he said. OR said to her, and he pointed at Cyril, Ubani Law.
Yeah, but you see, what is happening is that there is a photo that is floating, that floated in response, showing Cyril Ramaphosa with Oliver Tambo, I think it was in Zambia, saying that it could not have been, that he asked Ubani Law, in counter to this alleged question that the former president of the ANC asked. But it could be that he asked the question indeed, like you're saying, you were there. He asked the question. Maybe he had forgotten about it.
Well, I mean, it was one meeting. I don't know how the one meeting disproves that he asked the question.
Yeah.
And as I said, Ngako Romantlodi said, yeah, he did ask the question. I heard Ngako yesterday confirming telephonically when we spoke.
Yeah.
I don't want to say who's the comrade who phoned me. But someone on the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. But anyhow, the point is there were those who were part of this process who clearly were already in the pockets of white monopoly capitalism. And I believe very firmly that one of those people was Tito Mboweni. And why do I say that? Because Tito was the person who actually carried out the act of removing the commitment to nationalization in a very important speech that President Mandela in 1992 was due to deliver at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I was part of writing that speech.
Yeah.
I worked together with the ANC's economic unit. And we were absolutely astonished when we were listening to President Mandela delivering the speech. And he suddenly declared that nationalization is no longer part of our economic program and was embracing new liberal economic policies. And Tito just did it. And he even joked years later here at a forum discussion in Rosebank. He said, no, you know, I literally threw the ANC's commitment to nationalization, I tossed it into the bin in Davos.
Well, that is confirmed by Ronnie Casrills. There is a video where Ronnie Casrills mentions who were the people who were responsible for that. And he does mention Tito Mboweni. And he goes further, he talks about a meeting that was held in Zambia in 1986, in which the former President Kaunda was an observer, and the ANC heavyweights were meeting Anglo-American, executives. And then Anglo-American apparently was saying that they did not have a problem with the democratic elections, a democratic government, and so forth. But they had a problem with one thing, the ANC's commitment to nationalization. That if they dropped nationalization, everything would be fine. That was in 1986, according to Ronnie Casrills. Now, what happened...
But at that point, the ANC didn't say we're going to drop nationalization.
No, it didn't.
But what Ronnie is saying is it was registered there as a concern.
Yes.
By Anglo-American.
Yes.
And of course, it was part of a process which started through those pre-discussions before the negotiations started.
Yes.
Which led us eventually up the garden path of dropping nationalization.
Yes. So Ronnie raises this issue of saying the ANC did not insist to Anglo-American that no, we are defending, we are firm on nationalization.
So it was soft.
It was soft. And then he says that was because...
And the person who was the leader in those negotiations was one Thabo Mbeki.
Yeah. He says they were there, Artambo was there, everybody was there, heavyweights. He mentions heavyweights. So, interestingly, nobody from the people who were in that meeting has come out to rebut what Ronnie Casrills said, And even in the literature, what you are talking about, the role of Tito Mboweni and so forth, and the economic unit of the ANC, it's mentioned. I mean, the first IMF loan that South Africa got was through the agreement or the approval of that economic unit. The late Professor Vishnu Padayachi and Professor Ben Fine wrote a paper before Professor Vishnu passed on. Wrote a paper clearly stating that that is the person who was responsible, who approved for the ANC, who basically gave the ANC's perspective that the Nationalist Party or the Transitional Executive Committee at that time, Council at that time, could proceed to the IMF and get the first loan. So, by that time, the ANC was gone. And when you spoke ANC policy as expressed in the historic documents, like 1969, Freedom Charter, and so forth, you would be ridiculed, you know, you would be said to be basing your ideas on old social democratic, you know, policies and so forth, because there was a shift. And that shift is still dominant to this day. But, you know, because the ANC has been captured by white monopoly capital, there's always that reaction within the ANC, that resistance of what I would call the genuine ANC ideological forces that want to see the ANC back on the path of national liberation. So when there was this resolution on radical economic transformation, it was a radical phase of the second transition, something like that. It was an expression and an acknowledgement that the ANC had deviated, that the NDR was no longer on track. And it is that resistance, that need to pull the ANC to the left, that strengthens the hold of
But you recall what happened at the 54th National Conference, where when those issues were under discussion, we literally very closely came to blows on the conference floor. Because what was happening is there were elections, and you remember through brown envelopes, 1 billion rand, buying of votes. Cyril Ramaphosa and co managed to get into power, and then followed the discussion on the radical economic transformation. Now, what happened there was that discussion and the majority of people who were supporting those resolutions on radical economic transformation were an indication of what the real majority inside that conference was. And that the elections was an aberration based on the position of manipulation and of the buying of votes. And the conference at that point was on a knife's edge. It was ready to collapse. But what happened was that Ramaphosa himself intervened and went and told some of the comrades who wanted to resist the passing of the resolution on the radical economic transformation, and told them, no, we'll manage this thing afterwards. We have gained so much by getting ourselves elected. Let's not put it into jeopardy. And that's how we then proceeded to pass resolutions on the radical economic transformation, which flew directly in the face of those who were elected as the leadership of the African National Congress. And in that process, there was a fundamental conflict. I would say an impossibly to breach conflict. Which was built into the African National Congress. And there is, I think, the foundation from that conference of the current factionalism that we have in the ANC, which is impossible to breach, as far as I can see. What is your comments on those things that I've just said?
My view is that you are correct, and what is called factionalism in the ANC, through it might reflect different business interests among leaders.
Like, for instance, sometimes it is Gwede Mantashe pushing fossil fuels, and on the other side, there's Cyril Ramaphosa and his crowd who do the renewable energy thing, and they start fighting amongst themselves within white monopoly capitalism, but they're still all part of this white monopoly capitalist monolith.
Exactly. So there are those secondary contradictions that you would find. But the true fissure in the ANC, that which breaks the ANC in the middle, so to speak, is the rupture between the ideological orientation of the leadership and the general ideological orientation of the membership. Because every time after 1990s, if I can put it like that, when the membership of the ANC takes resolutions, the resolutions are radical and left in orientation. But you find that the leadership that emerges adopts a right-wing position. So there's always this rupture that happens all the time. And now it has found clear expression where you see resolutions of the ANC being adopted and elaboration of those resolutions as to how they're supposed to be implemented as a basis to establish unity within the ANC around the program as articulated by the resolutions is absent because the resolutions are not implemented. And these resolutions, they reflect the general ideological position of the ANC membership, which in my view reflects the general ideological feel in the country of the social forces that are the engines of the revolution that the ANC is pursuing. So there's this rupture between the leadership and the general population that the ANC is supposed to lead. You see this when it comes to the land question. The ANC is supposed to return the land to its rightful owners, which is fundamentally the African people in South Africa. That's why the ANC was formed in response to the hardships and the exclusion of African people in the economy, from the land dispossession, super exploitation, and even oppression, right? But you have a situation where you have a leadership that actively defends, the oppression, marginalization, continued super exploitation, and dispossession of African people. So it's a massive contradiction.
But that contradiction finds itself expressed also in terms of the material conditions of that leadership compared to the mass base of support within the African National Congress. And I've always said that one of the most important investigations, which we are not doing, is to find out how this leadership ended up becoming instant millionaires and billionaires. How did it happen that I knew Cyril Ramaphosa when he was driving a Volkswagen Golf, and 2 years later he was in the back of a big 7 Series BMW. And today he's, I'm sure, in much bigger cars than that. And he's buying buffaloes for 20 million, and he's having $8 million US at his farm at Pala Pala, and so we go on. So what happened there? Because surely this was not because of these incredible economic and business prowess of these people to become such instant millionaires. Surely there was something that was given to them in order for them to, in return, maintain white monopoly capitalism.
It goes back to the capture that happened in the 80s, early 90s. But also, I think we're seeing it live, what revolutionaries such as Fanon and Cabral were talking about when they were saying that the national liberation movement is often led by the petty bourgeoisie that aspires to get into the shoes of the colonizing force. But do nothing after that. Just take the resources and sit and just accumulate. You don't industrialize the country, you don't turn the economy so that it serves the interest of the people. You just accumulate wealth for yourself, your family, and friends, and you allow the masses of the people to wallow in squalor. So what we are seeing is precisely the type of transformation that Fanon and Amilcar Cabral were talking about. And Amilcar Cabral even said there is a choice between the leadership of the National Liberation Movement that it needs to take between whether you betray the revolution or you commit class suicide or you pursue the revolution without compromise. And then he says the progress of the national liberation struggle is therefore dependent on morals. There's a certain level, a certain point at which the struggle depends on morals. When the people of South Africa, when the African majority give leadership a mandate to go and negotiate on their behalf for the return of the land, the wealth, the basic wealth of the country and so forth, they were very clear that the land must be returned, the basic monopolies, the banks, in the Freedom Charter. It was clearly articulated. And what did the leadership do? The leadership negotiates for themselves, for their pockets. They own the mines, they are sitting on white-owned banks, They are sitting on boards of monopolies, of white establishments. That's not what the people mandated the leadership to do. The leadership was supposed to come back and say, no, the white monopoly capital, the social force is resisting your demands. So therefore the struggle continues. As to how the struggle continues, the leadership and the people are supposed to sit and work out a strategy. But to continue in a country which is African, but with an economy that is white dominated, colonial, it's a huge, it's not an embarrassment, but it's a humiliation. It's a humiliation because the African people in South Africa do not own anything. Yet, there is this national liberation movement.
But then, in short, what one has to say is that this leadership ourselves,
Yeah.
they have betrayed the revolution.
They have betrayed the revolution.
They have decided that they're going to look after themselves and their families.
Yes.
And they don't care what happens to the majority of poor in this country. In fact, they will even help to repress the poor.
Yes.
As we have seen, this morning I went to the beginning of the Malikane trial.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting case because it relates to the so-called concomitant email that Ramaphosa sent, where he was saying that this struggle there in Malikane is not a labor issue, it's a criminal matter. Now here we have someone who in the past was a labor leader, the Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers, who then decides to totally turn the struggle for liberation and the class struggle on its head and call it criminal. And then demand from the police and the South African Defence Force to take vicious action in order to repress those workers. And that is exactly what he did. So it is the personification of this betrayal and the personification of turning yourself against the people and becoming the people's enemy. Now, how do we deal with this situation now? Because here we have Cyril Ramaphosa as president of the country. We've got Enoch Godongwana as Minister of Finance. We have the former Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, the whole cahoot. They are not going to bring liberation. But yet they are the guys who sit in the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. They refuse to implement the resolutions of the 54th National Conference. Nothing about radical economic transformation has been implemented. They derailed the whole process of the return of the land without compensation to the people. What must happen now? How do we deal with this situation?
It's a very tough one, but one thing that I know is a strategy is to basically set the ANC up to fail dismally so that it completely loses the confidence of the people. And so the ANC loses that political capital. It becomes a joke, even to the upcoming youth, And then once the people have lost confidence in the ANC, then you've got the emergence of multi-party, what you call coalition. You have the emergence of coalition politics.
The kind of thing that we're seeing in some of the metros already now.
Exactly.
And with it comes weak government.
Weak government, incoherence, fragmentation, no cross purposes when it comes to certain policies and so forth. So the aim is to fragment the ANC. It's too big. It needs to be fragmented, and then you have this. The reason why the ANC has to be fragmented is because the grip of white monopoly capital of the ANC is now exposed. It's well known, But in the early 90s, there was that euphoria, that this leadership is going to bring about liberation and all of that. So the 2000s come, the labor movement begins to be more militant against the policies of neoliberalism that this leadership is adopting, right? So as time goes on and on, you have a situation where finally, you have 2007, where the working class and the youth decides to break away, to rise up in order for the ANC to break away from neoliberalism. And that's how President Jacob Zuma emerges, propelled by this axis of the working class and the youth of the ANC, right? Now, you move forward. You look at what happens to that axis. That axis gets liquidated. And when it gets liquidated over time, then, but before it gets liquidated, that axis posed a very huge threat to the control of white monopoly capital of the ANC, right? And it showed that the white monopoly capital can lose control of the ANC if this axis continued to be hegemonic. Now, the first action is to liquidate that axis, but also to liquidate the ANC, so that you create multiple centers through which you can control the economy. We know there's an oligarchy. There's this new term that has been popularized since the war with the Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine, called the oligarchy. So the oligarchy that controls the South African economy will remain in charge, but using different political centers in the form of a coalition to manage the whole situation. That's the strategy now. So I think the majority of the people, particularly African people, will make a grievous mistake if they were to, in my view, lose faith in the ANC without understanding that their movement was actually captured. They have to wrestle their movement from these capturers and set it on a path to national liberation. That's the challenge now. Branches have made their pronouncements, but the masses of the people who stay around which the branches are operating, they need to be aware that politically the ANC remains a very, very powerful and a very active center of contestation, without which, if they lose complete control of that contestation, it will be chaos. It will be a disaster. Already, there are gains, transformation gains that are being reversed. BEE is now...
It's being pushed back.
It's being pushed back.
There are decisions by the courts, led by Solidarity, to push back black economic empowerment.
Yes.
President Ramaphosa seems to buy into that whole process.
Exactly.
Saying that he's appointing now a special committee to reconsider black economic empowerment and, as he says, modernize it.
Yeah.
But in the same process, you can see that it is going to be eventually ditched.
Yeah.
So in this whole situation, what I'm seeing, and I agree with you, is that black economic empowerment is going to be destroyed. The African National Congress, if we are not careful, will be splintered, will become a minority party in South Africa, and coalition politics and coalition government will become the order of the day. And perhaps Cyril Ramaphosa will even emerge as the leader of these coalition governments. But at the end of the day, white monopoly capitalism will be able to pull all the strings, because there will be no strong center of power, which the African National Congress is. So the challenge is, how do the people who you say really want to see fundamental economic change, how do they recapture the African National Congress?
You know, the cadres of the ANC, they know how to organize. They need to go back to basics and begin to organize. But go back to basics and organize in terms of strategy and tactics. How do you organize a counterforce to this oligarchy? You need a way of organizing, because what is clear, this oligarchy is not democratic. So you need you need a democratic way of organizing, but you need a much more powerful way of organizing that cannot be seen by the naked eye. Just as much as we can see this oligarchy when it holds meetings and so forth, you need that type of organization to also happen so that it activates the forces that can be given confidence to come forward and then wrestle the movement from the current path. That's the only way. There's not going to be unity. You know, this unity, renewal, and so forth. You can't have unity when you are not implementing the Freedom Charter. You know, you can't have unity when there's no radical program like a Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter is to the people of this country. You know, you need a leadership that will firmly put the Freedom Charter up and say, we are back. When we say unity, when we say renewal, we mean we are going back to this document. We are going to elaborate each and every clause in this document as to how we are going to implement it. Not this riffraff of saying, no, the economy is now more sophisticated that the Freedom Charter envisaged and so forth. No, it's just riffraff, you know. The Freedom Charter remains as relevant as ever. If we look at the economies that are fast growing today, look at China, look at India, South Korea, you know, those economies are structured along the lines of the Freedom Charter, where there's a strong state involvement.
And a highly successful economy.
Highly successful, you know. But for us to have that type of an economy, we need a leadership, you know, to emerge. Not this leadership. Not this leadership. And the way in which the ANC, in my view, is electing leadership is problematic, you know. Yes, it's contestation, they call it democracy and so forth, but we know, like Nazarek has shown, right? If you come with a bag of money and then you take over, what democracy is there? The Chief Justice, former Chief Justice Mkhweng, did say that when money is involved, what democracy can you talk about when it is trumped by money, when it can be bought? So people need to be very, very honest and say, yes, we want a democratic form of organization, but the manner in which the leadership is going to be selected needs to be quite different. I don't know how to put it, but if we open it up for people to raise their hand, please elect me, it's not going to work. That's not how the ANC, in my view, you know, the best leadership of the ANC emerged historically. You know, it is this what can I say? Obsession with excessive obsession with democracy. You know, to a point of not understanding that revolutionary leadership does not necessarily arise because somebody voted for it. It has never happened. Mao Zedong did not emerge like that. Lenin did not emerge like that. Fidel Castro did not emerge like that. You know, all these leaders that were successful, who are the friends of the National Liberation Movement, did not emerge like that, you know. So yeah, even one could argue that even the choice of the ANC that a leader such as O.R. Tambo should go abroad and build the movement abroad did not come through O.R. Tambo raising a hand and saying, elect me, I want to go abroad.
No, there was a plan.
There was a plan, yeah.
And that plan was implemented.
Yeah.
Now, what you are saying is we need to return to the historical roots of the African National Congress, and out of there emerge a plan.
Yeah.
And then we will know who the leaders are who are able to implement this plan.
Yeah.
And that plan, yes, of course, it has to be within the structures and organizational processes of the ANC, but it mustn't be exclusively within the ANC.
Yes.
It must also be within the broad democratic movement in South Africa.
Yeah.
And a critical part of that plan must be African unity.
Yeah.
So building African unity amongst all progressives, whether they are in the African National Congress or in other political formations, is going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I believe very firmly that there is a majority of South Africans who want to see fundamental economic transformation.
Yeah.
As long as we can develop a program and a plan to muster the power of those in South Africa who are the majority, but who have been prevented from seeing their future arriving by this oligarchy that you are referring to, who was bought and who became part of the agents
Yes.
of white monopoly capital.
Yeah.
So how do we take that forward in this year, 2022, the national conference here of the African National Congress, where there's provincial conferences, regional conferences already taking place, where we're coming up for a policy conference, where the policy conference documents had been now recently published by the ANC, and I must say they are an absolute shambles. It is an embarrassment that the African National Congress can have new liberal economic policies, where even the head, Comrade Kubai from the head of the Economic Policy Unit or Commission of the African National Congress, doesn't seem to know elbow from backside what is actually happening and what the economic policies of the African National Congress should be. No historical understanding, no understanding of all these historical documents that you've referred to, but simply talking about a new liberal so-called partnership between private sector and the state. How do we deal with this issue? And how do we come to December 2022 and the people will feel that out of the African National Congress conference, the 55th conference of the ANC, hope will emerge rather than a continuation of a sense of defeat and of desperation.
Yeah, the ANC members need to look at leaders, not on the basis of who's raising their hands to be elected, but they need to search within the ANC for leaders who have demonstrated, both in theory and in practice, consistency in the articulation, ideological orientation of the ANC, historic ideological orientation of the ANC. Those leaders who have been consistent about the need to radically transform the economy and society, to the implementation of the Freedom Charter. You need to listen carefully to their ideological articulations and whether they understand the historic documents of the ANC. And if they have led elsewhere, look at their track record. Yeah, in terms of implementing the Freedom Charter in the limited spaces that they've operated. The idea that we are going to elect a comrade because the comrade has been in the ANC for more than 15 years and so forth is not going to assist. We need quality now. It's important that quality be chosen, but that quality must be determined by two things: ideological orientation and technical capacity to implement ideological commitments. Encourage. We don't want people, you elect people, they go to platforms internationally. When they arrive in those platforms, they cow. They get told that no, your policies are going to scare off investors, without them responding to say, but these policies that you want us to implement have wreaked havoc in our communities, particularly African communities, and are worsening historic inequalities in our country and creating social instability. We need a leadership that can stand firm on the ideological ground and articulate those policy positions of the ANC. But also, what is important, we need a leadership that is going to crack open the state apparatus and clean it of agents that are sabotaging the implementation of ANC resolutions. Because you don't want a bureaucracy that is not aligned to the implementation of your resolutions. In China, it's a Communist Party is in charge, where you've got more than 90% of the bureaucrats being members of the Communist Party. In South Africa, it's different. But the fact that the ANC or a ruling party has won elections on the basis of its policy positions, that bureaucracy needs to toe the line. And if it does not toe the line, then it needs to be cleaned out for as long as that ruling party is in charge. So what you've seen in South Africa is that there's been also resistance within the state apparatus because the ANC did not dismantle the apartheid state and create its own state. So it inherited some elements, and a large chunk of the elements have been inherited by
one of the strongest resistance, areas of resistance was in the Department of Finance.
Exactly. It was
and the Ministry of Finance. So
yes.
you will know it very well because you worked there.
Yeah.
And you experienced the resistance.
Yeah.
And you experienced
Yeah.
the way in which you were eventually worked out of it.
Yeah.
Because you were not towing the line.
Yes, I could not agree with proceeding along the same path. You know, but you see, it's a network. It's a network. You find these forces that are resisting implementation of radical policies inside the state, by the state, right? In different areas. When it comes to, for example, procurement, basic procurement, there's no reporting on the racial breakdown and the gender breakdown of procurement, right? Each and every department. And incidentally, I find that many of the managers who are doing that are Africans, which goes to show, again, the story that Cabral was talking about, the issue of morals. These Africans who are in the state apparatus continuing to benefit white monopoly capital, right? What do they think? What are their interests? You know, so there's a lot of work. The new leadership that the ANC needs to bring about in order to implement a radical economic transformation, radical socio-economic transformation, will have first and foremost to come into collision with the state apparatus and clean it, and fashion the state apparatus in a new light.
Someone said to me the other day, you know, in the past, and they were even referring to the period, as you say, that period of disruption.
Yeah.
That came when President Zuma came in with those forces.
Yeah.
They said, yes, you guys managed to gain some control, but you were playing marbles with power. And I think what you are saying is we need to be ideologically clear, and then we must be prepared to implement and use the power at our disposal.
Yeah.
You know, as I'm listening to you, Chris, I'm beginning to understand even better why Chris Hani was assassinated. Because it was exactly this kind of leadership that you referred to. Historically proper in terms of how the man operated. Ideologically clear and prepared to have the courage to challenge the status quo and the bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
That was the reason why Chris was killed. And it is the kind of leader that Chris was that we need now.
Yeah.
So we need to find those leaders.
Yeah.
But it must be in a context where there's not the death of ideology.
Yes.
Because at the moment what we see in the African National Congress is the death of ideology.
Yeah.
There's no ideological clarity. There's no commitment to a radical economic and ideological policy program.
Yeah. Just to add to that, you see, there's this point that you mentioned about the economic policy document where it talks about a partnership between the state and the private sector. You know,
and the need to privatize the state-owned enterprises and all of those things.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
So let's start with the framing of issues. When you say a partnership between the state and the private sector, right? It's being superficial and being obfuscating at the same time ideologically, because the ANC needs to be clear what partnership between which social forces first, which class forces are supposed to be in partnership or in alliance first. So you resolve that at the level of strategy and tactics.
Exactly.
And then you come to the economic transformation, and then you say, because those class forces are supposed to be in partnership, right? In terms of the economy, how are the interests of these class forces going to be reconciled, and what interest each class force is supposed to have in the economy for you to give a basis for that political alliance that is established in the strategy and tactics document. So when you say that there needs to be a partnership between the state and the private sector, which private sector are you talking about? The white-dominated private sector. And whose state are you talking about? The white monopoly capitalist state. The one that is... So basically it's empty, ideologically bereft. You know? Then you take it a step further. You are saying we need to privatize. What are you privatizing? Transnet is a monopoly in the rail system. Eskom is a monopoly in the energy sector, electricity sector. So the Freedom Charter, what does the Freedom Charter say about monopolies? It says that monopoly industries, the banks, must be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole and must not be owned by a few individuals, be they white or black. Right? That's the strategy and tactics interpreting the Freedom Charter. But the NC does not envision privatization of state monopolies. No, it envisions actually nationalization of monopolies and the strengthening of state monopolies so that they continue to be in the hands of the people as a whole, not in my friends or in my family's pocket. That is
exactly what that speech that President Mandela was supposed to have delivered in January 1992 at Davos was saying. I know, because I was part of writing that speech. And that is exactly what Tito Mboweni removed.
Yeah.
So if anyone asks me why I'm so angry with Tito, it's because he helped to destroy the hope of our people and this fundamental transformation that you have just articulated so well.
Yeah.
Chris, there's still a lot that we can talk about, but our time is limited now. What we are going to do is we're going to have regular discussions about our economy and the need for this radical economic transformation program, this ideological implementation, the way in which it should be done. I'm going on a regular basis to invite Professor Malikane and some of his fellow radical economists to come and talk about those issues. And in this part of In My Crosshairs, Mpangazitha in Conversation, we are going to take the policy documents that the African National Congress has recently published, those wishy-washy, liberal, wah-wah documents, and we're going to analyze them. We're going to analyze them in the context of this radical and fundamental and ideologically sound approach. And we're going to deal with those issues with clarity and with revolutionary commitment. So to you as viewers, I invite you to continue to join me on this journey of conversations, to subscribe, to make sure that you hit that button that will remind you that you must come back and follow the next part, the next installment of this important conversation that we want to have with our people. Thank you very much for listening.
Isibongo sika Carl Niehaus. Isibongo sika Carl Niehaus. Mpangazitha. Inyoni emhlophe eqwanjengelanda ebhula amaphiko azamazama umhlaba. Inkanyamba endizele phezulu wanyakazibhakabhaka. Umshawe wathi monopoly capital ilanga lishisa babaleke ongcowa kulezi senkulu bawucesha phansi wedaba zone na imthande lapha ethi mahashula kanacala umpangazitha imthande lapha ethi viva nqamalala umpangazitha imthande lapha ethi umnotho nomhlaba ufinyelele ezandleni zabantu abamnyama omhlophe eqwandaba ezitha imthande ngokutusa nokukhuthaza iradical economic transformation wangajike bala Carl Niehaus umafele mpinje ngesoja uma kade bona eHollywood olesihonga amazikahle amabhunu obandlulula yabaleka mayembona